Op-ed today over at HartmannReport.com is titled, "Why the GOP is No Longer a Legitimate Political Party." And, this is pretty straightforward stuff. It started out, I read it. Well, actually, I start out by pointing out that there's a piece over in the in U.S. News and World Report. The headline says the whole thing. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene rises from GOP fringe to front. And, she was literally standing behind Kevin McCarthy when he announced the new Republican agenda. She has been brought into the face, the public-facing face of the Republican Party, rather than being kept in the background, in the back of it. Why and how? Well, because the Republican Party is no longer a normal political party. Normal political parties have governing philosophies. And the Republican Party no longer has one. They arguably used to have one. They used to be the party of let's move slowly. Yes, we want to improve America, but we want to do it carefully and gradually. They were the party of, let's not have government get too large, although, Dwight Eisenhower in 1956 ran for Republican president. Dwight Eisenhower ran for re-election on a platform of how many additional millions of people had gotten union jobs and joined unions, and how many additional millions of people had signed up for Social Security. But, the Republican Party no longer has that. There's no real rudder there any longer. Instead, it's become this coalition of interest groups, each seeking their own ends. And, so how did they get here? Well, it started with the billionaires. Back in the 1950s, they weren't worth billions. In today's dollars, they would have been, but they were called multimillionaires back then. Dwight Eisenhower wrote about them in 1954 in a letter to his brother Edgar. He said, "Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear that party again in our political history." There's a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes you can do these things. Among them are H.L. Hunt, you possibly know his background, a few other Texas oil millionaires, and an occasional politician or businessman from other areas. Their number is negligible, and they are stupid. One of the things I found really interesting looking for this quote yesterday, I used to always pull it off the Eisenhower Library website. The Eisenhower Library has taken it off their website. It's like, they got too much crap from Republicans, I think, or maybe billionaires. But, the letter's out there, and it's a real letter, and it's a real letter from Dwight Eisenhower to his brother. So, anyhow, what Eisenhower never anticipated was that 5 corrupt Republican appointees on the U.S. Supreme Court would change the laws in America in the 1970s. Eisenhower died in '69. Would change the laws in America. In fact, the main decision, the Bellotti decision, was written by Lewis Powell himself in 1978. That allowed Ronald Reagan to float into the White House on an absolute tsunami of fossil fuel money. Saying that, political bribery is not bribery anymore. It's free speech. But the billionaires, having a party that's just made up of billionaires isn't enough to win an election. There aren't enough billionaires in America. There's only just a little short of 800 billionaires in America. We have the world's largest supply of them, but that's not enough to win an election. So the Republican Party had to put together a coalition. And the coalition that they came up with was, number one, the Southern white racists. This was the low-hanging fruit, right? This is what Nixon identified with his Southern strategy. The Democrats basically surrendered the Southern white racists in 1964 and 65 with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And Kevin Phillips wrote about this in 1970. He said, now keep in mind, 1970, and he was talking about what Nixon had done in the '68 election and how going forward this was going to be their strategy. He wrote, quote, "From now on, the Republicans are never going to get more than 10 to 20% of the Negro vote, and they don't need any more than that. The more Negroes who register as Democrats in the South, the sooner the Negro-phobe whites will quit the Democrats and become Republicans. That's where the votes are. Without that prodding from the blacks, the whites will backslide into their old comfortable arrangement with the local Democrats." In other words, Republicans are essentially encouraging Democrats to embrace the black vote because that will further push away the white racist vote. And that's exactly what happened. Number two, so number one, the Southern white racists. This is the Republican coalition. Number two, homophobes and misogynists. people who hate queer people, people who hate women. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, this group was actively courted by the right-wing hate radio hosts like Limbaugh with his Hillary Clinton testicle lockbox and his feminazis. And, there's enough men out there who are insecure about their own sexuality that hating on women and queer folk became a popular sport, particularly as women and gay rights movements gained steam during that era, the 80s and 90s. Number three, the third part of the Republican coalition, lower middle class working white people. Now, this was the result of just genuinely genius branding, largely promoted by Lee Atwater back in the day, and exploit the brands of NASCAR, the NFL, and country music, which were reliably Democratic until the 1980s, causing working class white people to think that the Republican Party was their home. Then the fourth part of the coalition was upper middle class white people. This is ironically, the group that's been most badly screwed by Republican parties. Your average surgeon in America making $200,000 or $300,000 a year is paying around 50% income tax. Now, billionaires are paying 3% income tax. What's wrong with this picture? The Republicans have drilled all kinds of holes in the tax code for the billionaires, but none for the people making $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 a year. And there's a lot of people in that category. I mean, a doctor and a lawyer married could have easily an income of $500,000 a year. And these are the people who are paying 50% income taxes because of Republican policies. But still, they overwhelmingly vote for Republicans because the Republican tax cut mantra sounds good to them, right? They're bearing the brunt of that. And then finally, the fifth group that makes up the Republican coalition are the authoritarian followers. These are people who just want Big Daddy to tell them how to think, how to behave, and how to vote. It's that simple. They make up the majority of the traitors on January 6th, although there's some overlap there with the racists. And, they're ready to follow the next authoritarian leader who replaces Trump, a position for which DeSantis, Hawley, Scott, Cotton, and Cruz are competing. And, because the Republican Party has no unifying philosophy outside of hate and fear, their governing class, the politicians who make up the Republican Party, are similarly fractured. They're basically in three categories of people. The predatory grifters, that's like, Mehmet Oz and Matt Gaetz and Rick Scott. Rick Scott's company, when he was head of it, his hospital company, was convicted of the largest Medicare fraud in the history of America. The wannabe stars and fame seekers like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, and Ted Cruz. And the Putin-style autocrats like Blake Masters, Doug Mastriano, and Ron DeSantis. Donald Trump filled all three categories, which is why he became king of the thieves and why, Republicans politicians are finding him such a hard act to follow. He's a fascist, and he's rich, and he's famous, and he's a grifter. So here we are. Which raises the question. I mean, we can pretty much predict what will happen if Republicans win the House or Senate in this election this fall, in 4 weeks from now. They will, they're going to shut down the government. They're going to do everything they can to promote fascism. They're going to try and destroy American democracy. They've already told us that. But what if they lose? How's that going to end? Some people say, well, yeah, America's like 1929 Italy or 1934 Germany, but really, in Italy and Germany, Mussolini and Hitler actually had coherent governing philosophies. They were nationalists and largely embraced by their people till they went nuts. I mean, arguably they went nuts from the beginning, which is a whole different story. But what's going to happen to the Republican Party? Is it going to devolve into a rump party? Is it, if they lose in the election, is that going to double energize them like happened in the early 1930s with the Nazis when they lost to the communists and the socialists and came back even stronger? I mean, at this point, it's impossible to know. But having a clear vision of how we got here and where we are right now, I think will help us navigate this uncertain future.